As the ritual begins, the lights and equipment being blown out by a mysterious power surge seem to dispel what is left of Indy's skepticism. After everything he's been through in pursuit of the Ark and the secrets it holds, he decides he is not meant to witness what is about to happen, nor is any mortal. So he and his partner stand, tied back to back, eyes shut, as the wrath of God is let loose around them. Welcome to the Indiana Jones Lorecast, where we delve into the lore and the history of the Indiana Jones franchise. Hello everyone, welcome back to the show. Today is a monumentous occasion indeed, because we will be covering the Raiders of the Lost Ark film, the first ever Indiana Jones film, the world's introduction to one of the greatest characters in all of fiction. This film is my personal favourite among the Indiana Jones films, and is in fact my favourite live-action film of all time. So needless to say, I'm quite excited to record this episode, so without any further delay, let us hop right in and begin our story. The film begins by opening up on a jungle. We are in South America in the year 1936, and Indiana Jones is travelling through this jungle to find a temple. At the start of the film, we don't actually see Indy's face yet. We only kind of see him from behind as he walks around with this group of guides that he's with and reads maps and surveys the area. We see the hat and the outfit, but we don't see his face quite yet, as they are letting it build up to possibly one of the coolest intros to a character in cinema history, but we'll get to that in just a second. Something important to bring up before we get to that point is the fact that as they are traversing the jungle, they come across this old ancient stone carving of some kind, this face, which clearly has meaning in some way because it seems to rattle the nerves of one of the guides, sending him running and screaming. There are now only 2 guides left, along with Indy, travelling through the jungle, and though Indy does not know it yet, these 2 men have less than savoury intentions. As they walk through the trees, Indy comes across this small wooden dart that is wedged into one of the tree trunks, and he sort of takes it out and throws it to the ground, but the 2 guides run up to it, with one of them licking the tip of it and spitting it out. It is poison, as he suspected, no doubt from the Jovitos tribe, which are the natives in this region, and the other tells him that if they knew that they were there, they would have killed them already. So they move on, obviously very uneasy. We eventually come to a scene by a river where Indy's reading a map to try and figure out where they need to go, of course, and it is at this point that one of the guides decides to try and make his move. This man's name, though we never really learn it, is Barranca, and he decides to pull out a revolver really slowly. He aims to shoot Indy in the back, but unfortunately for him, Indy hears the sound of him doing this and is very quickly aware of what he's trying to do. So before he can fire the weapon, Indy takes out his whip and whips him in the hand, causing him to drop the firearm, and it goes off upon hitting the ground. Barranca then runs off holding his probably very injured hand as Indy very dramatically steps forth from the shadows that he's standing under, and we get to see for the first time his face. And the music and the sound effects and everything in the scene is so fantastic. I'm actually going to play it for you to have a listen to. Enjoy. So cool, absolutely brilliant. So, moving on, the last remaining man, whose name is Satipo, decides that he's not quite ready to try his luck with Indy yet, so he just remains passive, and Indy seems to be alright with him hanging around for now, not immediately aware of the fact that he too intends to betray him. It is also safe to assume that the man who ran off earlier was also a part of this little plot of theirs, but of course now Satipo is the only one remaining who can do anything. At last they come to the temple that they are looking for, And going inside, it's the quintessential adventure Lost Temple type deal. There are extremely thick cobwebs, there are spiders and all sorts of little creepy crawlies running around, spike traps, dart traps. It is the classic. So making it past all of these little obstacles, Indy has to also leave his whip behind over this small pit. There is a pit which is a bit too risky to jump as it's a bit too far for comfort, and there is a bar, this wooden trunk above it, which he's able to latch onto with his whip, and he leaves it there just for convenient access, as he of course is keeping in mind that he may have to leave here in a hurry. This of course comes in handy later. They then arrive at the room which houses the artifact that they are after. It is this small golden fertility idol, and Indy sort of very carefully makes his way across the floor tiles, which obviously might cause further booby traps, and makes it at last to the center of this large chamber and crouches down before the artifact. And this, like many others in this movie, is a scene that is referenced constantly in other media. You know, the sort of crouching down, rubbing your chin thoughtfully. And what he's doing in this scene is trying to have a guess at the weight of the idol, as the pedestal that it stands on is very likely a pressure plate, and will be triggered if there is the slightest change of weight detected upon it. And so he takes out a bag which is filled with sand and tries to guess how much this thing would weigh and to make the sandbag weigh the same amount, and then attempts to do this very careful switcheroo with it. And after doing this, with Satipo watching on very nervously from the hallway, everything seems to have worked. And it is at this point that the ground begins to rumble and the entire temple begins to fall apart around them, as Indy this time around has no time to carefully traverse the booby traps, simply sprinting past everything as all the darts fly past him. It's absolute chaos. The two men make it to that pit with the whip hanging over it, and Satipo goes over first, but the whip actually ends up coming undone and falling to the ground along with Satipo. So Indy is now on the side of this pit that he obviously doesn't want to be on, and Satipo is on the side that he needs to be on with his whip. So there's this kind of awkward exchange of, you throw me the whip, and Satipo asks him to throw him the idol first. So having really no choice, he does so. But it is at this point that Satipo's treachery shows its ugly face, and he leaves the whip on the ground and just takes off running to the exit of the temple, leaving Indy for dead. He of course is not going to just accept this, so he jumps over the gap and has this incredibly tense moment as this door is shutting in front of him, as he's trying to climb up out of this pit, as he's basically hanging on by old vines and pieces of grass, but he eventually does. And rolling under the door dramatically and grabbing his whip at the last second and making everybody who's watching's fingers tingle because he nearly lost his, he comes to find Satipo dead, impaled on one of the spike traps that they carefully got past on the way in. And of course it is quite gruesome. He is impaled, through his head, his torso. It's not a pretty scene. So Indy takes the golden fertility idol from him and continues to run out of the temple. And it is at this point that we get our next iconic scene, as hearing a rumbling noise, Indy looks up behind him to see this enormous boulder trap be triggered. And so he is forced to run for his life with the idol as this boulder rolls down and begins chasing him down this hallway. And after the tense chase, he leaps out of the front entrance to the temple as the boulder slams into it, sealing off the temple, it would seem, and he just rolls into the bushes and is then met with about, I don't know how many, there are dozens of Jovito's tribesmen surrounding him, all with bows and arrows and spears. He is in a bit of a predicament here. And along with these Jovito's tribesmen is a face that he recognizes. This Frenchman named René Belloc, who is one of his most iconic villains. He is essentially another archaeologist. They actually know each other from earlier in life, but that's not from this film. As far as we need to know for this movie, they are sort of just rival colleagues, and of course Belloc has some very shady dealings going on and is prepared to do whatever it takes to get his hands on the artifacts that he wants. Just yes, as we'll come to see throughout the film, Belloc is not the nicest dude. But anyway, he very smugly takes the artifact from Indy, as again, Indy really doesn't have a say in what happens now. And we also see that the Jovitos tribesmen have killed Baronka. He obviously ran into them after being disarmed by Indy, and now has dozens of darts sticking out of his back, so yes, he is very dead. So once Belloc takes the idol from Indy, he holds it up far above his head and speaks to the Jovitos in their own language, causing them all to sort of bow down out of respect for the idol. But Indy takes this opportunity to just take off running, and so Belloc obviously gives the command to the Jovitos to go after him and kill him. So now Indy is running through the jungle with these dozens of tribesmen chasing him, and hurling spears at him and firing arrows at him as he runs towards this river, where a man and his plane are waiting for him. This man's name is Jock Lindsay, and he has one of those small pontoon planes, and this was Indy's getaway, which is obviously very hastily being put to use now. So Jock is fishing, sitting on his plane, when he hears Indy screaming to start the engines, and obviously looking up, he sees him running up to the river, and then these just Jovitos tribesmen emerge from the trees behind him, chasing him. So, of course, he very quickly gets the plane started, and Indy swings off of a vine and lands in the river and swims to the plane as Jock is taking off, with arrows and spears hitting the water all around them, but luckily none find their mark. And as the two of them take off in the plane, we get this really funny scene as we are introduced to the character of Reggie, who is a very large snake that is owned by Jock. But Indy, it seems, is only aware of his presence now. This is the audience's first introduction to Indy's fear of snakes, as he sort of slumps down into the plane seat, all exhausted, and then sees the snake intertwined with his feet in the footwell of the plane, and screams to Jock that there's a large snake in the plane, but he just says that that's his pet snake, Reggie. To which Indy screams quite loudly that he hates snakes. So there's our introduction to that little character trait of his. And so the plane flies off into the distance, and though Indy did not get the idol he was looking for, he of course is lucky enough to escape with his life. So that ends the little intro to the film in South America. We are then taken back to the United States, where Indy is in his classroom teaching. And as he is at the board at the front teaching the students, he happens to catch that one of the young ladies in his classroom has written the words love and you on her eyelids. So when she very intentionally and slowly blinks at him, he can see the words love you. And he is, of course, a little bit taken aback by this. He doesn't really say anything about it, but you can tell he's very uncomfortable with it, as I'm sure many of us would be. I'm not sure which is stranger though, that on its own or the fact that she wrote that on her eyelids. Every time I watch it, I just imagine her having to stand for hours in front of a mirror to get that right, because you'd have to write it backwards on your own eyelid. I don't want to think about that anymore. But anyway, as so often happens in these stories, Indy leaves his phone notifications on, and that interrupts the classroom. Excuse me. No, but seriously, he is interrupted, or not interrupted I should say, but Marcus Brody enters his classroom, and after the bell rings, Marcus approaches his desk and he tells him, that he had the idol in his hands. At the last second it was taken from him, like he was so close to having it. But Marcus tells him that there are actually two men here at the school to see him. These two men are from Army intelligence, and they're here to talk to Indy in relation to someone that he used to be colleagues with. They intercepted some German intelligence which suggests that the Nazis are very interested in a Professor Abner Ravenwood for some reason. And Indy used to be a student of Ravenwood's and was in fact very close with him. But they have not spoken in quite a few years, as there was some type of falling out between them. So with Indy's help interpreting this message from German intelligence, they are able to learn a few things. Firstly, it would seem that the Germans are close to discovering the location of the Ark of the Covenant. Now this piques Indy's interest, because if this is true, this is an incredibly significant find, as the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to be this golden chest, this container, that is supposed to have the 10 Commandments inside. This was where Moses stored the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on them. It is supposed to have this incredibly powerful energy within it. According to the legends, an army which carries the Ark with it is pretty much guaranteed to win in any conquest, in any endeavor. So of course Adolf Hitler is quite interested in this. And their interest in Abner Ravenwood comes from the fact that he was at some point trying to find the headpiece of an artifact called the Staff of Ra. And this Staff of Ra, the stick part of the staff is not really important. That can be any piece of wood, any piece of metal. What's important is the headpiece, because the headpiece is this golden, really ornate headpiece with a jewel in the center. And this jewel, if placed at this particular spot in this map room at a particular time of day, would have the sunlight shine through the center of it, revealing the location on the map where the Ark is buried, because the Ark was stolen from Jerusalem in the 10th century BC. So it is currently in Egypt somewhere, though no one has known where. But if the Nazis get their hands on the Staff of Ra, they will be able to find out soon. So Indy is, as you can imagine, very much on the case, and he decides that he's going to travel to Nepal to try and track down this headpiece of the Staff of Ra. And while packing his suitcase, he's talking to Marcus Brody, and Marcus sort of speaks about, what the implications of this are, if this artifact truly is what the stories say that it is, and if it really holds some kind of power, this could be dangerous. But it is at this point that we learn Indy's sort of beliefs, as he says to Marcus that he doesn't believe in any of that, supernatural hocus pocus. And as he's saying this to Marcus, he just throws his revolver into his suitcase to fly on a plane. And that's very jarring to see, watching that you can just bring a gun in your suitcase without any issues, it seems. How times have changed. Anyway, so he boards a plane and flies over to the snowy mountains of Nepal, and we see that in a small village or town there is a bar. And this bar is run by this young woman, very pretty young woman with dark brown hair, who is currently engaging in a drinking game, taking shots. And this is a game that she wins, as the person that she's drinking against just collapses completely unconscious as everyone around her is passing off money to each other, as everyone in the bar was betting on who would win. So anyway, everybody sort of clears out as it is quite late in the evening. Everybody stumbles home, and once the bar is left empty, the woman stands in the main sort of area with the tables and chairs when she looks up on the wall to see the silhouette of Indiana Jones, who has just entered the bar. And turning around, she sort of smiles at him, hands on her hips, and greets him, this Indiana Jones. And upon him approaching her and asking about the headpiece to the Staff of Ra, she just decks him in the face, just punches him, because she is of course quite upset at him, because it is at this point that we learn that this woman is Marion Ravenwood, Professor Abner Ravenwood's daughter. And we come to learn that while Indy was a friend and student of her father, they themselves, Indy and Marion, had a relationship, which he, it would seem, walked out on. And the relationship between Indy and Marion is quite complicated. It is very much an on and off type of thing, but she is the one. Of all of the ladies throughout the Indiana Jones stories, she is the one. His true love, I suppose you could say. And complicated though the relationship may be, no matter how many times they may break up or separate, they always seem to find each other again. And though this is the first Indy film, this is one of those times. that they have seemed to enter each other's lives once again, though it might have been better if it were under better circumstances. So they stand very tensely discussing the headpiece of Ra, as Marion explains that her father dragged her out here to Nepal on all of the expeditions you went on and died, leaving her to very much fend for herself, trying to make it in this very, sort of harsh place that she's unfamiliar with. So over the last few years, she's had to, really try to make ends meet and has very clearly had a rough time doing it. Indy, of course, didn't know about this. I'm not sure anybody knew what was happening with her, but he, of course, would have come to help her had he known. But anyway, she tells him that she does not have the headpiece, and basically tells him to shove off. And so after he leaves the bar, she sits by herself, and from inside her shirt she takes out her necklace, but it is not a necklace at all. It is the headpiece. And examining it for a moment, she just sets it down on the table as a new group of men enter the bar. And she tells them that they're closed, but as the man at the head of the group says, they are not thirsty. This man is wearing this sort of black coat with this black hat on, and he has these small round glasses on. His name is Arnold Todt, and he is a Nazi agent. The men that are with him are clearly hired thugs of some kind. They are locals. And he begins threatening Marion, luckily not noticing that the staff headpiece is just sitting on one of the tables. And he has the men hold her down on the bar as he heats up one of the pokers by the fire and approaches her, clearly intending to torture the answers out of her. But luckily, it would seem that Indy noticed what was going on, as he then re-enters the bar, and this intense gunfight then erupts between him and the hired thugs and Todt. During the fight, Marion joins Indy in fighting off the thugs and Todt, as the bar is unfortunately set on fire during the course of the gunfight and begins to burn down around them. As the gunfight is coming to a close, Todt notices the headpiece to the staff. Obviously, in this tense moment, he did not take into account the fact that the headpiece is metal and is sitting basically in a fire in some upturned furniture, and upon grabbing it, it burns into his hand, and he immediately lets it go and runs out the bar screaming, having to dive headfirst into the snow to put some snow on his burnt hand. So he gets away in this instance. So Marion and Indy escape the burning bar themselves after retrieving the headpiece with a piece of cloth, not making the same mistake as Todt did. They stand on the snowy, dark street outside as Marion declares that she's now his partner in this, so she's coming with him. The pair of them then travel to Cairo in Egypt, and Indy goes to meet with an old friend of his named Salah. This is another fantastic character. Love Salah, he's one of my favourites from the whole franchise. He is an Egyptian digger and is very skilled at what he does. Him and Indy have evidently worked together in the past before the events of this movie. They sit and explain to Salah the whole situation with the headpiece and having to use it in the map room in the ancient city of Tanis, which is where the dig is currently, with Salah explaining that the Germans' dig operation is enormous. The dig site is absolutely huge, basically just over the whole city, as there was this huge sandstorm which buried it at some point. And this is, of course, the reason for the huge dig site. They're trying to find all these old buildings buried under the sand to hopefully find where the Ark might have been hidden. So while they're staying there, Indy and Marion decide to go for a walk about the city. They're walking around Cairo's markets when they are attacked by this group of swordsmen, these assassins or thugs. I'm not too sure what they are, but they have swords anyway, so bad news. This very cool and drawn-out fight scene happens as Indy is fighting them off, and Marion is trying to flee, but also is fighting them off as well, making very good use of a frying pan at one point, and she is unfortunately captured and carried off in a basket, And the reason she is found and captured is because she is ratted out by this damn monkey. Now, if you'll just bear with me for a second, this monkey annoyed me so very deeply, and is in fact a huge contributing factor to my lifelong dislike, distrust, and honestly disdain for monkeys. You may think that is cruel, but alongside the annoying character of this monkey in this film, I have suffered great losses to monkeys, which I shan't recount here, as it is too painful to even discuss, but you'll have to just take my word for it. I've experienced great pain at the hands of monkey kind. I either find them annoying or scary, depending on how big they are. But anyway, moving past my personal grievances with primates, the fight continues in the streets of Cairo, as Indy at one point faces off with this one swordsman who makes quite a flashy display of his swordsmanship, flinging this sword around as this whole crowd kind of gathers in awe around Indy and this man. And Indy just sort of, with this very exhausted look on his face, just draws his revolver and shoots the guy. And just a little bit of film trivia, this was in fact caused by food poisoning that Harrison Ford and in fact most of the cast and crew were experiencing on the day of filming. There was originally a whole choreographed fight scene, but this is what ended up being done instead. And in my opinion, the film is much better for it, because this is one of the most memorable bits from it. So this whole fight and chase comes to a close when Marion is loaded into the back of a truck, and they begin to drive off with her. And Indy, arriving and seeing this, fires at the truck, and the truck then overturns and there are explosives on the back, and the whole truck just bursts into flames. It is completely destroyed in a fireball. And this, luckily, was not actually the truck which had Marion inside, but Indy doesn't know this. So he thinks that Marion has just died. And so we see Indy sits in this bar and is obviously distraught. And strangely enough, that damn monkey is on the counter in front of him, seemingly like offering comfort or sympathy. I mean, he's the reason that she got caught in the first place, and now he's here like trying to... Oh, manipulative monkey. Anyway, moving on before I go on for hours again. He is then summoned by some Nazi agents to go and meet with Belloc, who is also now in Egypt on this dig. And once Indy is brought to Belloc, they have this lengthy discussion, or I should say Belloc just has this monologue about how him and Indy are in fact the same. So yes, after the iconic villain speech, the classic "you and I aren't so different," Indy is of course not in the mood for any of it, as he thinks he's just lost Marion. And so upon threatening Belloc, all of the sort of bad guys in the place point their guns at Indy, but he says that he's prepared to just go see God with him. You know, he'll just die and kill Belloc as well. He's obviously, you know, there is death in the man's eyes. But it is at this point that Salah's children come running into this establishment and all like basically hug and surround Indy, all asking him to come home. Salah has quite a few children, and so they all run in and just basically save Indy's life, as all of the bad guys in the place begin to laugh, as in like, oh well, you're like, kids have to save you. And Belloc makes this remark how, you know, there will not always be small children around to help him. So they allow the children and Indy to leave. So that evening, Salah and Indy go to meet with a man who decodes the markings that are on the headpiece. Something interesting to note here is that the Germans have already found the map room and used the staff to find the location of the Ark. Now, how have they done this if they don't have the headpiece? Well, it's because of Tot. The fact that he had half of the headpiece burnt into his hand, they had half of the markings from the headpiece. And basically all the markings on the headpiece are instructions. They tell you how long the staff stick should be. And obviously the length of the stick is going to determine where the sunlight reveals on the map. So the Germans have already found the Ark's location, or so they think. But what Indy and Sala discover upon having the full message decoded back and front of the staff, they find that the front half, the side that the Germans have, describes how long the stick should be, but then the back side of the headpiece says to then shorten it further from that point. So the Germans only have half of the equation here, which means that the stick that they obviously cut and used in the map room is too long. They're digging in the wrong place. Indy and Sala, of course, elated by this news, and they then make plans to assemble a dig team and go and take the Ark right out from beneath the Germans' noses. But they first have to sneak into the Germans' dig site and to the map room to use the staff themselves, this time, of course, with the correct stick length. So another interesting scene to note here before we move on to the dig site is that the monkey, I haven't actually mentioned this yet, is owned by this other sort of assassin guy with an eye patch. And this is the guy who sort of sends the monkey to gather information. It's quite strange, but this guy sneaks in and poisons some dates that are sitting in a bowl. And Indy is about to eat one when Sala stops him. Sala literally steps in and catches the date in mid-air as Indy was about to pop it into his mouth. And he then makes Indy look at the monkey, which is now lying dead on the floor. It would seem that the monkey ate one of the dates and has now succumbed to the poison that its own master put on those dates. So I don't think that guy took that into account, but I think it's safe to say that the monkey's life of crime and sin have led it to this moment. Anyway, moving on. So, Indy and Sala sneak into the dig site and find where the map room is. It's just kind of this circular stone hole in the ground, as of course, like I mentioned earlier, this entire city is buried under an entire sand dune, basically. Another important thing to bring up is while sneaking into the dig site, Indy comes across Marion, who is tied up in one of the tents. And he, of course, is super happy to see her, and he's busy untying her when he realizes, like, wait a minute, if we free you, this is gonna, raise the alarm and jeopardize us finding the Ark. So he basically tells her, like, I'll come back for you, but I can't free you yet. And she's, like, screaming at him, like, really angry at him, but he just sort of puts the cloth back in her mouth and ties her, like, makes sure she's still tied up, and then runs out of the tent. And he's in a disguise as well, wearing all these robes to sort of blend in with the rest of the people on the dig site. So he enters the map room, and after some tense moments of almost being discovered by the Nazi guards on the site, they manage to get what they want. He uses the Staff of Ra with the correctly cut stick, and it reveals the precise location where the Ark is. It is in a chamber called the Well of Souls, and now they know exactly where it is. So Indy, Sala, and Sala's dig team go up. It's kind of up on this little rise overlooking the whole German dig site, so they're just out of view, and they begin work, getting rid of all the sand. They work long into the night, and after what is probably hours of work, they at last uncover a stone surface, and the sky overhead has turned incredibly violent suddenly. There is thick dark clouds everywhere, and a lot of thunder and lightning, heavy thunder. As the dig team wedge and remove this large stone slab from what is obviously the roof of this chamber, revealing this cavernous pitch black hole beneath them. And as they all stand looking into it, they can swear that the floor is moving. The floor seems to be moving. And once a torch is thrown down, at this point Indy is lying on his stomach, sort of peering over the edge into this dark chamber. And once a torch is dropped into it, it is revealed that the entire floor of the Well of Souls is full of snakes. And we are going to quickly hop over to the mid-break as Indy rolls over to his side, eyes vacant and staring, and speaking to no one in particular, he says,
"Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?"
Why, hello there, and welcome to the mid-break. And yes, the piece of audio that I use at the start of all my mid-breaks is in fact from this very scene of the film. that line that Indy says. So I did not care where this scene was going to end up in this episode time-wise, I just knew that that was where the mid-break was going to be. So I really wanted to line that up, so be sure to applaud my cleverness in the comments. But this is just a short segment of each episode where I get to discuss a few things about the show itself and some little details that you might want to know about. Firstly, I'm Cal, also Bandit, and thank you so very much for listening. I hope you're enjoying the episode. And if you are enjoying the episode, you can let me know by leaving a review or rating wherever you are listening to this podcast. It is available wherever you can get your podcasts. Of course, ratings and reviews very much help with the show's growth, and on Apple Podcasts, if you leave a rating of 5 stars along with a written review along with it, I will be reading out that review on a future episode in the mid-breaks, like this one. So if that's something you're interested in, getting a message onto an episode, letting me know what you're enjoying about it, then feel free to head over there and do that. If you'd like to get in contact with me for any reason, feel free to do so. You can find all the relevant links in the episode description to the socials for the show, as well as the Discord server and the email address. And I would also like to bring attention to the subreddit, which I have started for the show, so you can head over and join that to become a fully certified scholar in Indiana Jones. So if that's something you'd be interested in, then head over and check it out. But that is all that needs to be really said for this mid-break, so we are going to jump right back into the Well of Souls.
I'm going after that truck. How? I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
After using torches and just fire in general, they manage to get rid of a great deal of the snakes that litter the bottom of the Well of Souls. And Indy and Sala then climb down inside, and they then find, at last, the Ark of the Covenant. They find it inside this ancient stone case that's around it. So they open it up, and there's just this brilliant golden light shining from within. And as they take the Ark out, it's this very intense moment, I suppose, as this thing almost seems to light up the entire chamber. It is just as magnificent as you would expect, this gold jewel-encrusted case, and it has these 2 handles to make for easy carrying by 2 people. But as they are taking this ark out of the well and hoisting it up to the surface, we unfortunately see that the Germans have found them out. With the rising sun, they are able to just straight up walk outside and see this weird dig team working up on the hill. So they understand what must be happening, and of course send a whole bunch of people to sort it out. So once the ark had been hoisted up and Sala climbs up, unaware of what's going on, he is immediately snatched by the Nazis, and the entire dig team is basically under arrest at this point. Indy is not yet aware of this until he looks up and sees none other than Belloc waving down at him. And, I mean, he's not too jazzed about that, as you can imagine. There is now this whole group of soldiers holding the whole dig team at gunpoint, and they've actually brought Marion along with them. And the colonel, who's in charge of the whole operation, Colonel Dietrich, he intends to throw Marion down into the Well of Souls with Indy, and then seal them inside, leave them for dead. But Belloc is not too happy about this. He intended to keep Marion safe. As much as she obviously wants nothing to do with him, it is very obvious that he has some kind of feelings for her. But despite his protests, the colonel has her thrown down into the chamber as Indy just clumsily catches her down below, and they then have the chamber sealed, leaving Marion and Indy in what would be total darkness if not for the last few torches on the ground that are still left burning. But there are still a lot of snakes on the ground, hundreds, and once the fires die out, which they will very soon die out, they will be in pitch black, and also the snakes will no longer have any flames to fear, so they are very much on the clock now. So once they're sealed inside, there's sort of this moment of them panicking, and Marion is like climbing up on Indy's shoulders, trying to get away from the snakes. And as they sort of waving the torches at all the snakes, she at one point sees his whip on his waist and just in a sheer moment of panic sticks the torch into his thigh, kind of just into his side, thinking that it's a snake crawling up onto him. And they eventually end up escaping because Indy comes up with this plan to climb up onto this large statue. It's this very, very big statue that reaches all the way to the top of the chamber. And using his whip, he climbs up and swings, gets this thing to fall and bust through one of the side walls of the chamber. Now this leads to further chambers and hallways off to the side. And as Marion climbs through this hole in the wall, we then see that this chamber is filled with corpses. They are perhaps mummified, I'm not too sure, but they do not look very pleasant. And there's the scene straight out of a horror film where it seems like all of these corpses have come to life and are straight up attacking Marion. But I'm quite sure this is just meant to represent her fear, suddenly being surrounded by all these dead bodies, and they all look very scary. But I mean, the way the scene is done, I remember as a kid, I thought that these corpses had just come to life and were trying to grab her and everything. But I suppose knowing some of the other crazy stories from the franchise, looking back on it now, I suppose that wouldn't be too insane of a thing to happen. So anyway, they push this enormous block out of, it's a strange kind of back entrance to the thing, which I think would have been way less trouble to go that way the first time around, but of course none of them knew about it. But luckily they know about it now, as they end up coming out of the tomb, or the chamber I should say, in the sort of nondiscreet spot of the dig site, where no one can see them. There's just kind of this one guy sleeping up against the wall, one of the diggers presumably. So Marion and Indy sort of escape, and they come to this sort of makeshift airstrip that the Germans have. And on this big open area of this airbase is this enormous aircraft, this Luftwaffe aircraft that is going to be taking the Ark back to Berlin. The Ark at this point is in a crate. They have it all boxed up and everything, and it's ready to be taken away. But Marion and Indy, of course, put a huge spanner in the works when they tried to take over the plane. And in doing so, there's this really great fight scene between Indy and this very, very large aircraft mechanic, I think he is. He's one of the Germans anyway, one of the German soldiers. And he kind of takes his shirt off, and him and Indy have this boxing match, and it ends quite graphically as this man is chopped to bits in the propellers of this plane. Because the plane at this point ends up turning, just doing constant 360s, because Marion knocks the pilot unconscious in the cockpit and also gets herself locked inside. And she, of course, has no idea how to fly the thing or operate it at all. Turn it off, like all that's just not an option. So with this plane turning around, she uses the guns on it as well to blow up some German reinforcements that are on the way, as of course there's a huge ruckus being made by all of this. And long story short, Indy has to shoot the lock on the cockpit to get Marion out, and they then just ditch the plane. They take off running, as this fuel line from all the shooting at the German reinforcements, this causes this sort of a fuel spill, and this ends up blowing the plane up. And I mean, I don't know much about aircraft mechanics, but I do know that fuel for big planes like this is quite the spectacular fireworks show when ignited, unintentionally anyway. So with the plane exploding, they of course have no way to get it to Berlin as quickly as they'd hoped. So they of course have to shift their plans, it seems. And Sala reunites with Marion and Indy in this tent off to the side. They're all hidden. And he's of course happy that they're still alive. He thought that they were probably going to die down there. And he tells them that the Ark is being loaded onto a truck and being taken to Cairo. So Indy then says that he's going to go after it. And this is the second bit of audio that I use in the mid-breaks. At the end of each of my mid-breaks is when asked how, he just says that he's making this up as he goes. So off he goes indeed, and he decides to take a horse, as it is obviously his best option in this scenario. So off he goes after the convoy, and there's quite a few trucks and vehicles. And so he catches up to this one truck and climbs aboard, and so ensues the the staple, insane vehicle action sequence that is present in almost every Indiana Jones story. They really did such a great job with this scene, and I won't describe every little thing that happens in it. If for some reason you haven't seen the film, again, you really should do yourself a favor and go check it out. This scene, you'll see what I mean when you watch it. It's just great. There's some humor sprinkled in there. It's really tense. It's great. But the sort of brief summary of it is he goes from truck to truck, essentially, and knocks all the people out of it, and eventually gets to the truck that has the Ark inside. And after some very tense fighting with the driver of that truck, he eventually runs the car with the Colonel and Belloc inside. He runs them off the road and just takes off, racing off with the Ark. And of course, bad guys aren't happy about that. And so now, for the time being, Indy has actually reclaimed the Ark. Then we see that Indy has actually made it to Cairo with the Ark safely. So him and Marion from Cairo are going to depart on a ship. And so they do. They take the Ark and leave Egypt. And they part ways with Sala. It's this very, it's a nice pleasant parting, as Sala's left in very high spirits because of their victory. They've succeeded in getting the Ark out of the Germans' hands. And so on the ship we see Marion and Indy obviously are sort of spending time together and trying to, I'm sure this is a very confusing time for them because there's a lot of emotions swirling around, but in any case, they spend a lot of time together on the ship, and down in the cargo hold we see something pretty interesting take place, as we see the crate with the Ark inside, sitting just alone in the dark, in some dark corner of the cargo hold with some rats around it, and there's this sort of strange sound emanating from the crate, and the rats around it begin to behave a bit strangely, as we see that the swastika that is on the crate is burnt away from the inside. So, interesting, very interesting. But the peace on the ship, unfortunately, does not last very long, as Marion is woken up by Indy cocking his pistol, and when asked what he's doing, he says that the engines have stopped, and he's going to go find out why. The engines have stopped because the ship has been halted by a U-boat, a Nazi U-boat, which has caught up with them, and they are soon boarded by the Germans. On this U-boat is the Colonel from earlier, Colonel Dietrich, along with Belloc, and they find Marion aboard the ship, and they also find the Ark, and unfortunately take it, of course. They load it onto the U-boat as they are taking Marion as well. Now fortunately they didn't find Indy, as he was able to stay hidden as the ship was being searched, but the captain of the ship actually makes a pretty clever play here. As the Nazis are taking Marion, he asks if he may keep the woman on his ship because, well, I mean, you can work out what he means there. She's a woman on a ship full of men, but as disgusting as that would be, of course, this is just a believable story he's spinning to try and get them to leave her on the ship. He's just trying to save her from being taken. But of course the Nazis are having none of it. They go like, oh, you savage. No, we're taking her anyway. And Belloc seems to consider Marion a part of his compensation for his work on this project. So that's lovely. And yes, that was a pretty clever idea from the captain, but unfortunately it did not work. So Marion, along with the Ark, is taken onto the U-boat, and the U-boat leaves. But curiously, no one can find Indy, not even the crew of the ship that he was on. And as they're all discussing where he might be, they then spot him climbing onto the U-boat as it's submerging and leaving. And they're all cheering him on as he's doing this. And we're then shown that the U-boat travels to this sort of small island in the Aegean Sea. And Indy is still alive, obviously, when they arrive. So for those of you who might be wondering how he was able to do that, there was a deleted scene which shows him sort of submerged up to about, mid-torso level, hanging on for dear life to the periscope. Very cold, wet, and miserable. So thankfully it would seem that the U-boat never fully submerged throughout its journey, because of course he would have just been left to drown in the middle of the ocean. So yes, thankfully he was able to successfully stow away and is now on this island in the Aegean Sea along with all the Nazis. As the U-boat arrives at a submarine pen, it's one of those just naval base port type things. I'm sure you've seen it in movies before, with all the German flags hanging up everywhere, and Indy somehow manages to sneak off at the top of the U-boat and into the base without being seen. So he's of course exhausted and soaked, and he manages to knock out one of the guards and steal his uniform. And so he's just sort of covertly keeping an eye on things, waiting for the right time to reveal himself or try and get Marion out of there. But why are they here in the first place? Why not just go straight to Germany? Well, Belloc explains this. This was his idea, it would seem, as he plans to perform this ritual to open the Ark here to ensure that it's real. And Colonel Dietrich tells him that he is deeply uncomfortable with this Jewish ritual, and he asks if it's really necessary. To which Belloc explains that, well, would you rather go straight to Germany and only then find out when you're with Hitler if you've truly accomplished your mission? You know, so you don't get to Hitler and then only then go, oh wait, this thing needs AA batteries before it can work. You know, that just to ensure their victory beforehand. So they load the Ark off of the U-boat and are going to be taking it to this designated ritual site which has been set up. Indy, of course, follows. And as the Germans are walking to this ritual site, we see it's this sort of parade of people with them carrying the Ark, and everybody, Tot from Nepal, the guy who burnt his hand, he's there, the colonel's obviously there, Belloc's there, everybody's there, and they have Marion with them. And as they're sort of walking through this pass, through these rocks, Indy then makes himself known. He stands up on the sort of short cliff off to the side of where they're walking, holding a rocket launcher, and sort of just shouts out, lets them know he's there, and he just threatens to destroy the Ark. Or he says all he wants is Marion. And Belloc sort of calls his bluff in this moment, I suppose you could say, as he tells all the soldiers to step away from the Ark, and does so himself, and just sort of tells Indy, well, there you go, destroy it then. And Indy finds that he can't bring himself to, because Belloc is playing on his need for knowledge here. You know, again, this is such a significant find, you know, this historical, absolutely monumental find, and he knows that Indy won't be able to just destroy it, just like that. Not without knowing, at least, what's inside, and if it's real. So, Indy cannot bring himself to do it, and so he ends up being captured now, along with Marion. Before we move on from the scene, I'd like to just bring up something pretty funny here first. I'm sure some of you might be aware of the Belloc fly, and if you don't know what that is, allow me to grace you with this information. During the scene, the sort of standoff between Belloc and Indy while he's holding the rocket launcher, while Belloc is looking up and talking to Indy, you can see this fly land on his chin, on his face, and seemingly crawl into his mouth and just disappear. It doesn't come back out. And, you know, it very much looks like Belloc just straight up ate a fly. And you can tell it's real, like it looks eerily realistic, so it's not CG. So, I mean, you watch that and you think, wow, that actor really just ate a fly on set. It looks like he doesn't even notice it. But what happened in reality is the fly did fly away, but they for some reason just used visual effects to make it look like it goes into, like, between his lips and just disappears. So, for seemingly no reason at all, they decided to just have it canonically be that Belloc eats a fly by mistake while talking to Indy. So, that has absolutely nothing to do with the wider story, but it is just too good of a piece of info to leave out, so there's a fun little story for you. But now, we come at last to the opening of the Ark. And to set the scene here a little bit, there's this sort of makeshift altar, I suppose, in this rock formation, and the Ark has been set there at the very top, and there's all these spotlights and flags around the place. It's really, they've made a whole ceremony out of this. All the soldiers are of course there, and Belloc is wearing this sort of ceremonial attire as he's going to be the one to perform the ritual and open the Ark. Indy and Marion are tied to a post a short distance away. They are back to back, and they sort of just anxiously awaiting whatever happens once the Ark is opened. It is night time as well by the time this is taking place, hence all the spotlights and the generator and that whole setup. So once the Ark is opened, Belloc speaks the words he needs to speak, apparently, and the Ark is opened, and inside they find sand. There is seemingly nothing of real value in there. Now, I mean, as far as an artifact goes, this would still be very valuable, and if the 10 Commandments were supposed to be stored in here, the sand wouldn't really make me feel that despondent. I would still be digging like mad through there to try and find whatever's under the sand, but they don't really get the chance to, because they're of course at first very disappointed. You know, Belloc looks mortified, and the Colonel and, you know, basically everyone, even Indy, is just kind of smirking. You know, it didn't work. Boo-hoo, your plan failed. And he's just sort of listening to the laughter coming from the ritual site. But then everything is cut short by the strange noise that begins to emanate. It's difficult to describe it. It's sort of this weird humming, screaming sound that no one can really pinpoint the origin of. And it's at this point that the generator and the spotlights and all of the equipment that they have on the site inexplicably overloads and just blows up, and all the lights are now out. And this strange mist then begins to come out of the Ark. It just looks like this fog rolling down this ritual site, past the legs of all of the people who are there. And this light then comes from inside, and Belloc is of course looking down in amazement into the Ark, as it looks like storm clouds are inside of it. It looks like a small miniature storm inside of this Ark. And speaking of storm clouds, there are real storm clouds now rolling overhead, and there's once again thunder and lightning. This seems to be a byproduct of the Ark's power. And along with this scene, the sound effects and the soundtrack are of course doing an amazing job of setting the tone for the scene. The ambience of it all is fantastic. So what I'm going to do now is actually play an audio clip from this scene. The power of the Ark of the Covenant beginning to show itself. Throughout all of this, Indy has this really strange and concerned look on his face, and after a few moments he tells Marion to not look. No matter what happens, she keeps her eyes shut, and he does the same, because he gets the sense that whatever's about to happen, they are not meant to see. No one is meant to see. And I've seen a lot of debate on the subject of how Indy knew to close his eyes. But in this scenario, I think it's reasonable enough to assume that if this really sort of awesome holy power is being displayed and used, you may have yourself spared by just not looking. If you do not look upon it, you might be spared. I mean, I think most of us would try that at least. It's better than not trying anything. And as for how why he wanted to, because of course he has been very skeptical throughout the course of the whole film. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory in my opinion, because throughout the whole film, if you've spent all this time with people warning you, all these ominous things of, oh, but what if it's real? This thing is supposed to be very powerful. And then suddenly, here you are at the site of this ritual, and all this equipment just gets just blown up, along with this really ominous, hissing, like, mystical sound. I mean, that would be enough to turn anybody from a skeptic to a believer. So, I mean, of course, in this moment now, his skepticism was just completely gone. So, I mean, it does make sense to me why in this moment he would think to do that. So yes, that is what him and Marion do, as from the Ark, spirits come forth. These are strange, misty-looking, vaguely humanoid shapes who fly around with these strange, ethereal voices as they fly around the Nazis, and some of them seem quite bothered by it, as these things just surround all of them. And Belloc remarks that it's beautiful, as he and the rest of the Nazis are staring these things in the face. And it is at this point that everything shifts. A complete 180 happens. And as they are all staring at these spiritual beings, the faces of these beings turn from beautiful ones to ones which resemble rotting corpses. They are it's just this horrifying visage. And at this point, the Nazis begin to scream. And the music also shifts as well to this very scary type sound, as what begins to happen is, as everybody screams, they are all killed in various different ways. Most of the soldiers are killed by this strange lightning that fires out from the Ark and jumps between all of them, seemingly burning holes straight through their chests from the looks of it. And there are unique little deaths for the three main Nazi guys that we've seen throughout the film. That includes Belloc. One's face is seemingly drained of everything inside of it. The other's face melts. And finally, Belloc's head just straight up explodes as he looks down into the Ark, screaming at the top of his lungs. Now, one thing to be certain of in this case is, I think the therapy industry made a lot of money from this movie. Because yes, this scene traumatized many a small child, I believe, and some adults too. Yes, I'm sure we all remember the horror of watching this scene for the first time. And it's all done with practical effects as well. There's very minimal CGI when it comes to this whole scene, despite how fantastical the events that are taking place are. So yes, it is all the classic practical effects of exploding heads and melting wax figures and all that sort of stuff. So very, very gruesome. And yes, a fitting end for the villains of the film. Certainly a memorable one. And once all of the men were dead, the Ark then somehow consumes the corpses. It brings them back into the Ark along with the spirits. So once all this mist and all this, just everything has been sucked up into the Ark, and the lid of the chest then flies back down from the clouds as the bright light within finally subsides as the lid slams shut on the Ark, leaving the scene very eerily empty. There's just the Ark sitting up where it was the whole time, and Indy and Marion are the only two left in this whole scene. It is very daunting to look at. Indy and Marion also find that the ropes that they were bound with have been burnt off, and they have been thankfully spared. The plan worked. And that is the end of this whole escapade. From here, we see that Indy and Marion and the Ark return to America, and we see Indy and Marcus Brody in a meeting with those same two Army intelligence men from the start of the film. And they try and explain to these men that the Ark has this unimaginable power inside and it needs to be researched. And the Army intelligence men ensure them that it will be, and that they have top men working on it. And Indy then leaves and meets Marion outside on the steps to the building, calling the men inside bureaucratic fools because they don't understand what they have. And she replies by saying, well, she knows what she has, referring to him, obviously. It is then decided that they're going to go get a drink. So Marion takes Indy's arm and they walk happily off together down the stairs. And we then see, in the final scene of the film, that the Ark of the Covenant has been put into a crate once again, and he's been wheeled down to be put away in storage in this unimaginably large warehouse filled with other crates of all varying shapes and sizes. This is Hangar 51, which houses some very interesting things, as you can imagine. I mean, if the Ark is there, what else is in those crates? And this Hangar 51 is obviously supposed to be a sort of parallel or stand-in to Area 51. So again, one can only imagine what lies in there. And with the crate being put away into storage, the film ends, and we get the credits. And that is Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. I, again, absolutely adore this film. It is my favorite live action of all time, as I've said, and just everything about the way they made this film is amazing. It felt like 50 cases of lightning in a bottle all coming together to create this perfect storm of a film. You know, the cast, the soundtrack, the story, everything. The fact that they relied so heavily on practical effects rather than CGI. Everything just came together to give it this really great, grounded, earthy feel to it. It came together absolutely masterfully. And if somehow you are listening to this and have not yet watched the film yourself, what are you doing? Why are you even still listening to this? Turn this off immediately and go and watch it. And for those of you that have seen the film already, I do appreciate you listening to the episode regardless. I hope you enjoyed it. And when it comes to covering the film versus not covering the film, of course I'm aware that most people have seen the films, but have not read the comics or seen the video games from years ago, but it felt wrong to cover those stories that not many people have heard about, but without covering the films at all. You know, the things that started all of this. It just didn't feel right to do. So there we have it, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And that is going to be all for this episode. So thank you very much indeed for listening all the way to the end. And if you have any questions, you can find me in my office. But until then, remember, when walking through the desert, close your mouth. You'll catch flies. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Indiana Jones Lorecast. If you like what you hear and want to support the show, then drop a rating or review wherever you're listening. I'll see you next time.
Have you ever wanted to deep dive into the lore and stories behind all your favorite Marvel movies? Then do we have the show for you. I'm Captain Shenko.
And I'm Psych88. Join us as we dissect the media megalith that is the MCU. We'll talk about the origin stories, the fights, and everything in between.
The MCU Lorecast releases on all major podcasting platforms on Mondays as part of the Robots Radio Rocket Club and can be found on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.